Okay, welcome back, everyone. It's 4:32. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's conversation about Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's work across media, her ongoing influence in a range of disciplines, and the presentation of her work in this year's Whitney Biennial, Quiet as It's Kept. Again, I'm Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney. And we've just experienced Cha's Dictee through the collective efforts of so many amazing voices. I want to thank, again, all of our readers and Wendy Subway for their partnership. I also want to acknowledge our ASL interpreters, Vern Leon, Michael Barrios, and Lisa Reynolds. And in addition, we're now joined by Kara Valor, who is providing live captioning for this portion of the program. Thank you all. I'm eager to turn things over to our esteemed panel, so I'm going to introduce them now in the order that they will speak. We're expecting their remarks will be around 40 minutes in total, followed by some conversation and then time for questions and comments for the audience, although we've demonstrated time is fluid. But without further ado, in the order they'll speak. I'm delighted to welcome Soyoung Yoon, who's been a longtime collaborator and associate of the Whitneys. She's assistant professor and program director of art history and visual studies at the Department of the Arts, Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts, the New School. Yoon is also faculty at the Whitney Museum of American Art's Independent Study Program, also known as the ISP. Her research focuses on politics of mobility and rhetorics of testimony, witnessing, and storytelling in the moving image. She attends to questions of the apparatus in relation to the moving image, the body in motion, and the authorial voice. And Yoon was a recipient of a Hauser and Wirth Research Fellowship for her work on Theresa Hak Kyung Cha, and also contributed an essay to the exhibition catalog for the 2022 biennial. Na Mira is an artist and educator who lives and works on the lands of the Tongva, Gabrielino, Kiza, and Chumash nations, otherwise known as Los Angeles. Their work, Night Vision, Red as Never Been, is currently on view at the Whitney as part of the Whitney Biennial. It's on the 6th floor, if you haven't had a chance to see it yet. After now will be Joshua Chambers-Letson, who is a writer and performance theorist who teaches at Northwestern University. His books and essays place performance studies in conversation with a diverse set of fields, including Black studies, Asian American studies, art history, and critical theory, to theorize the role of that performance plays in the making and remaking of worlds for Black, Brown, Asian, queer, and trans ways of being and becoming. And Josh also contributed an essay to the biennial catalog. Una Chung is an associate professor of literature at Sarah Lawrence College. She teaches interdisciplinary courses in literature and media, feminist, queer, and postcolonial theories, with a special focus on cultural translation, travel literature, and Eastern philosophies. And Una has been part of the programming that Wendy's has been producing for this season of The Quick and the Dead, devoted to Theresa Cha. So it's my pleasure to welcome Soyoung Yoon.
So I wanted to begin by first thanking Adrian Edwards and David Breslin for inviting me to contribute to the Whitney Biennial's catalog. But I also want to especially thank Megan Hoyer for her brilliance, attention, and care to organizing this very long day of events. And very excited to be here. Thank you. Passions still run high. We are told about the pedagogic necessity of the dictee, where the student must write down literary passages that the teacher reads aloud, a daily spelling and grammar test that has been implemented in French elementary classrooms since the 19th century. The difficulty of the French dictation test and its reputation as a thing of dread, not so much an exercise as a rite of initiation, is due in part to how much spelling and grammar are intertwined in the French language. And as much as the dictee is a source of dread, it also produces shame, a singular and intense shame about the bad spelling of the mother tongue. Like the rite of confession, suggests Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's dictee. The opening chapter of Cha's book moves back and forth from the calls and responses of French language exercises to that of Catholic rites of Mass, which seek to interpolate the body of the individual, shaping the mouth, the lips, the breath into the subject who speaks. Quote, Q, who made thee? A, God made me to conspire in God's tongue, end quote. The first dictates were administered as tests for civil servants under Napoleon I. The dictee would enter classrooms a few years later as a tool for shaping, standardizing, and nationalizing the French language amid highly politicized attempts to modernize the French education system, the state battling with the Catholic Church over the control and reach of public education. The dictee then could be described as one of the cultural techniques that the media theorist Friedrich Kittler claimed as constituting the discourse network of the 1800s. Changes in the practices of language acquisition tied to bureaucratic reform, which were part and parcel of the changes in the formation of the family and the nation state, the divisions of labor across private and public spheres, according to which women were inscribed within the private sphere of the family as the primary caregivers and teachers of children, i.e. mothers. Mothers then would teach children how to speak, more importantly, the desire to speak, recoding the noise of the child's babble as that which could be interpreted as the nascent speech of an inner voice, a soul, or a spirit. Through the dictee, we would learn not only a language, but also the mother tongue. For the reader, the force of Cha's dictee, I'd argue, lies in part in the emphatic prose, which mimics the grip of this fantasy of the mother tongue over the body and over the body politic. In particular, there is an excessive deployment of punctuation through which the line of a sentence starts and stops over and over again, like the abruptness of the snaps, which beat out time, beat out directives for when and how to move, how to kneel, how to believe. Quote, first Friday, 1 hour before Mass, Mass every first Friday, dictee first, every Friday before Mass, dictee before. Back in the study hall, it is time. Snaps once, one step right from the desk, single file. Snaps twice, follow single line, end quote. Later in Cha's dictee, in a chapter that begins with an illustrated map of the two Koreas, the sharp cracking sounds of the snaps find a deadly resonance in the sudden breaks of silence amid the roar of a crowd in revolt, and the breaking up of bodies, the breaking down of sentences, the tear gas, the gunshots, the tears, the blood. The repeated violence, which will be deemed necessary to fortify the arbitrary line of the 38th parallel as a sovereign border, a border as sacred and inviolable as the laws and rules and customs that seek to guard the mother tongue against its othering. This scene of the demonstration is included in a letter that is addressed to Mother from Seoul, Korea on April 19th, but 18 years later. Dates such as April 19th are significant. The numbers 419 become a proper name, 419, in the history and collective memory of modern Korea for revolution, for the student protest that brought down the authoritarian and corrupt government of the First Republic in the spring of 1960, on the eve of the global 60s, and for the image of the student protester as Mata, a high school student, still a child, whose body was fished out of icy cold waters a month after his disappearance, with a tear gas grenade lodged in his right eye. And yet, the narrator of Cha's dictee repeats, quote, nothing has changed. We are at a standstill, end quote. For my own contribution to this year's Whitney Biennial's catalog, I wrote about encountering the standstill of the second, third, fourth waves of the pandemic, as well as the iterative beat of Cha's silent black and white 60mm film permutations, a film of repetitive still frame variations of Cha's sister Bernadette's face in close-up, except for a single still frame of Cha's own face that registers, if at all, through our double take. There is the difficulty of the film's wager on the future, the difficulty of drawing out a future tense from its seeming impossibility, including from the impossibility of our own desire, our own need to freeze the frame and hold onto the image of Cha's face. If we were to try to freeze the film and hold onto a single still frame from a film strip of approximately 14,400 frames, the frame would burn, we would destroy it. Today, we read Cha's dictee together. As the United States surpasses 1 million COVID deaths, as the Supreme Court with its newly consolidated conservative majority is expected to issue what is predicted to be one of the most disastrous gun law decisions in a decade, around the time as the court is also expected to overturn Roe versus Wade. As the Republican Party continues to incite a culture war in our classrooms about who has the right to not know this country's history and to not know themselves. The news blares yet again of a school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, by an 18-year-old adolescent with a semi-automatic gun, the deadliest elementary school shooting in a decade, a mere 11 days after the deadliest racist massacre in recent American history, the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, by another 18-year-old adolescent with a semi-automatic gun. Quote, back in the study hall, it is time, snaps once, one step right from the desk, single file, snaps twice, follow single line, end quote. In the context of this standstill then, we might recall the difficulty and the necessity of Cha's wager on the future. Quote, she would take on their punctuation. She waits to service this, theirs, punctuation. She would become herself demarcations, absorb it, spill it, seize upon the punctuation, last air, give her the relay, voice, assign, hand it, deliver, end quote. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much to the Whitney for having us and everyone for gathering to resonate with Cha's work. I looked up Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and there's a very old sculpture of her where she is literally reading from a cell phone. So I'm gonna go with Goddess and read from my phone too. I'm just gonna talk a little bit about my relationship with Cha and my work in the Whitney Biennial. So I first came across Dictee 20 years ago. I got this zine made by another queer Korean feminist teenager from Kansas, Yumi Lee. And I want to cite her because I was never taught Cha's work in school, and I want to underscore these undercommons because we are source and we make worlds. Photocopied on the cover of Lee's zine was the first page of Dictee. And I immediately went out and got the book and I guess started to become an artist. I saw this question in Cha's work of whether you could challenge a society while following the grammars and the silos of history it created. And she refuses answers. Cha breaks language, and language is law. She shatters the structures with voids. So this was really radical to me and also felt familiar. I grew up in Korea, Japan, China, and the US, and I was taught French. So my connection to language and place can be liminal, it shapeshifts. And through Cha's work, I saw that instead of speaking from a single place of authority, how to move in the sinew that connects everything. And this engagement with materiality and multiplicity is happening across all of Cha's mediums. And in her treatment of performance, identity, narrative, and time, which I carry through my own work as well. I'm not so interested in making a particular image as I am in witnessing what arrives and how it moves and how it might be encountered, which is an acknowledgement of the apparatus and of animism. Shout out to Namjoon Pik, who was a founder of video art and believed that the frequency in broadcast was a communication with the spirits. We are source, we make worlds. I'm casting a spell. And I'm imagining now the Eros propelling Cha to put her body into the projection of other things seen, other things heard, to break the fourth wall, to touch the light, to ride the dark between frames and be changed by each other. That's the Teguk, Samteguk, Taiki, the alchemy, which is what she believed art is. 2 years ago, I read Cha's notes for White Dust from Mongolia, a project she was still working on when she was killed. And in it, she describes a character in the past who has lost her memory and a character in the present who is retrieving those memories, and how these two timelines intersect. In the final scene, she describes character number 2 walking directly into a projection of train tracks to meet character number 1. So I asked in my automatic writing with my non-dominant hand and my eyes closed and my tongue waiting, what would happen if I recorded her final scene? And I received the word tesseract, which was not familiar to me, and I learned means the fourth dimension of a cube, which is hard for us to perceive because on Earth, we're in the third dimension. We're only briefly gorgeous, and so maybe in the fourth dimension, we're gorgeous forever. So the tesseract is often used to describe a portal to another world. So I asked for Cha's permission and my ancestors' protection, and I performed this scene on the full moon. In the performance, I used a microphone that I made based on an image my ancestors showed me of a channel of air. And I later learned a Korean cosmology where the first vibrations of the world emanate from flutes. So I taped a latex tube to a microphone and used it in the performance. And it didn't pick up any sound at first, but after several rounds of entering the projection and breaking the fourth wall, I heard something coming from the amplifier. And when I turned it up, voices started pouring out, just barely a word, an utterance that would loop and repeat very fast as more voices became layered on top of it. And after several months, the transmission became more clear, and I was able to decipher that it's a radio station called 1540 AM Radio Korea. And I don't have a radio, but this transmission has been playing ever since, and it's playing upstairs now. My video piece, Night Vision, Red as Never Been, was made with heat, with myth, with synchronicity, with matrilineal ancestral technology, and with Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's spirit. In 2018, while I was in South Korea researching my mother's shaman lineage, my infrared night camera began producing a glitch, repeating scenes from the past in the present, much like shamanism itself. After meditating with these broken scenes, I received a message. If you take your camera to the border, you can cross. And at the time, I knew it meant the DMZ, and I was able to use the glitch to transpose myself across the most guarded military landscape in the world. And as I've continued to use this camera, I'm guided through a series of signs and sounds and dreams to other sites of rupture, where I keep learning that death is not an end. These are borders because of that, borders of dimensionality. Infinity's seam. When you cut a photograph, it divides, but when you cut a hologram, it multiplies. The Korean shaman ritual is called a kut, and when she stands on knives, she makes contact. She's called manshin, meaning 10,000 spirits. On rare occasions, I was able to sing along with this channel of air, this radio signal. And it is an ecstasy to harmonize with the unknown. And every step of this work is an unknown, an act towards the then and there of love. After the Atlanta spa shootings, I asked, how do we rise? And I received the words, tarantula, cellar, shred. I asked what was in the cellar, and it said, stigma. Over the next several months, it became clear that I would go to the Puck building under a blood moon eclipse, as Cha described to me, red as never been. And actually, the night before, as I prepared in New York, uncertain of what I would do or what would happen or if this was real, I received my assigned section of Dictee that I was to read at the Los Angeles Dictee Marathon on the following eclipse, and it was red as never been. So though I was scared, I knew that if I brought my camera, I could cross. And months later, still uncertain of what this was I was making, I'm still making, I'm co-creating, I found an old recording of my mother, who always seems to arrive in my work. And she described a song she heard where a woman says she does not want to love right now. And I asked, when do you think she's going to love? Until in all cavities, she is flesh, is my mother's incantation of Cha, which sometimes seems an impossible promise, an impossible threat. But the infrared shows us that even in death, we glow.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Adrian and David and Megan, as well as to my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be here. When I was invited to join this panel, I was asked to reflect on the essay that I contributed to the catalog, and in particular, the very brief meditation upon Cha's performance practice in that essay. If I'm honest, more than anything, that essay is an act of memorialization of both of my grandparents who transitioned out of this life between August and October of 2022. My grandmother, Tatsuko Takano Chambers, was a Japanese immigrant and a survivor of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. And my grandfather, Cleo Mack Chambers, was a Black former Marine who survived US apartheid. They were 90 and 89 respectively. And part of what I was trying to think through in that essay is how to have a relationship with death and with the dead, and the role that aesthetics and performance in particular can play in such a pursuit. Megan, can I call up the first slide? Oh, do I have it? I have a thing to do it. Sorry. All right, okay, that's them. I'm a performance studies scholar, and one of the things that has always interested me about performance is its slippery ontology or being. Performance moves between a pleasurable and sensuous plentitude of presence at the same time that it withdraws into absence, loss, and memory. Performances can be repeated, reperformed, and restaged, but they're always different since the nowness of the event is always slipping away from you. Performance occurs in a borderland between being, emerging, and disappearing, such that it is no surprise that performance and ritual have long been used to mediate the impossible compresence of life and death, living with dying, living towards death, and dying to live, all themes that run suffuse in Cha's practice. In the catalog essay, I largely focused on artists in the biennial who engage performance, broadly construed, to make a language for describing the way we live with death and continue on with and without our dead, the way we keep them alive in and through performance, and the way we reconcile ourselves to the impossible and unbearable presence left by their absence in a world where history won't stop hurting, especially for Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous, queer, femme, and trans folk, other minoritarian folk who are subject to official histories that refuse to let us remember, either that our loved ones lived and that those lives had meaning, or that they died and that those deaths were commonly in the service of someone else's meaning-making agenda. That is a truth that haunts Cha's murder and the violence of it, as Professor Yoon beautifully reflects upon in her contribution to the catalog, as she asks, and this is a quote, "Where and to whom does Cha's death belong?" Performance, as it hovers between presence and absence, life and death, can help us to experience the difficulty of this question, if not answer it. Performance also has a power to reproduce and reanimate life. So I took a cue from Cha and included photographs of my parents in the grandparents in the essay, an act of revivification, including one of them at the wedding of my late great uncle, Billy Don, who died last summer, and great auntie Olivia, who continues to live on in the wake of his and my grandparents' loss. When Black and Asian life is so devalued and negated as it is in these United States, and I'm thinking here of Atlanta and Buffalo, as Korean life was during the brutality of Japan's unforgivable colonization of the peninsula, the mere fact of living on and living with grace and beauty and love can function as the negation of the negation. That force and power is everywhere present in Cha's work, as well as these photos and the lives they reflect. Here, in this photo, are 4 people who might otherwise be obscured away or forgotten, if not destroyed within the dominant histories of this country. But the incorporation of their images into the catalog could help to proliferate their ongoing multiplicity of being by using a vector of the institutional channels of art history, like the Whitney Biennial, to help keep them around and proliferating, reproducing even in their absence and after their deaths. My will to incorporate their stories and images into the catalog was drawn from a lesson that I learned many years ago when I first picked up Dictee as a college student, as she incorporated her own family's narratives into works including Dictee, reproducing photographs of her family members in pieces such as Chronology from 1977, in which she presented color photocopies of photos of her family with accompanying text. The impulse to smuggle my family's photos into the catalog was not about a neoliberal impulse at inclusion. Instead, the gesture was meant to function as an act of infiltration, deconstructing, rewriting, and fucking with what counts as American art or photography, or who counts as a living being in this time and place. If, as Lisa Lowe has written, Cha's work, and Dictee in particular, offers an elaboration upon the multiplicity of subject formations, each articulated at an intersection with others, that's a quote. Cha's incorporation of her family and their place in elided, occupied, displaced, and obscured histories reflects what one might see in the photo of Billy Dawn, Olivia, Cleo, and Ta-chan. Subtle, beautiful ways of being and living Black and Asian against the deadening forces of imperialism, war, apartheid, and any other misery that would make this life otherwise impossible. The act of including and reproducing these photos was meant as a gesture towards the proliferation of the multiplicities of being that Cha generated within her work, and it was undertaken with an ethos that might reflect what Cha writes in the Melpomene chapter of Dictee, quote, "From another epic, another history, from the missing narrative, from the multitude of narratives, missing, from the chronicles, for another telling, for other recitations." I should close by saying that my approach to the essay occluded the other essay I wanted to write and did not, because I could not, because it kept slipping away from me, an essay specifically about Cha's performance practice. One of the difficulties and pleasures of being a scholar of performance is that you are researching a phenomenon that you can never quite grasp, hold on to, or adequately account for. One can't go back and experience the performance. And even if one couldn't actually and fully capture what the performance was, since it was slipping away from and receding from presence. All that you have are the ghostly remnants a performance leaves behind. Something I'm confronted with whenever sifting through the ephemeral scraps that Cha left behind in her performance work, a script for Revel dans la Brune. I don't speak French at all. I am not classy. A 10-minute video document of that performance, photographs as she performs in that work, Aura Bleuel, pictured here, and others. What I encounter in this performance ephemera is the impossibility of, and the dangers even, of attempting to fix, freeze, and capture that which is meant to be fleeting, like a performance. And I have a note here that says unicide, which is to reference Professor Yoon's gesture to the dangers of capturing Cha's image, which she presented just now. When working with performance, instead of valuing that which can be held on to, captured, and collected, one learns to work with and from those things that are slipping away from us, disappeared and disappearing, but somehow also present in the fullness of their absence. This practice of learning to live and work with loss, or to live and work with death and grief even, can become a way of inhabiting a miraculously unfolding now, in which those who have been lost are still somehow here with us, and those we have yet to lose might yet find another way of emerging into the presence of a permanently unfolding now, one in which we live with death. For as Cha wrote in Dictee, and this is a quote, she says to herself that death would never come, could not possibly. She, knowing too that there was no displacing death, there was no overcoming without the actual dying. Thank you.
Rituals are symbolic acts. They represent and pass on the values and orders on which a community is based. They bring forth a community without communication. Today, however, communication without community prevails. These are the opening lines of Byung-Chul Han, a Korean-German philosopher's book, The Disappearance of Ritual. So for Han, ritual and the apparatus, as it were, are on opposite sides of a polarity that Han diagrams between community and communication. I believe Cha understands this diagram and uses these terms, but what is it exactly that she does with them? For Cha, the non-community that has been undermined from the outset by communication, this is a kind of familiar diagnosis of our hyper-mediated world today. But for Cha, this cannot be given up on, for this is Asian America. Asian American history is mapped on a timeline where blocks of years can be defined by the appearance, duration, then disappearance or change of an entire population dependent on immigration laws establishing a new ban or quota on people of various national origins from Asia. And of course, we must include here laws against miscegenation, mob violence, and dangerous working conditions. There's a lot more that could be said about immigration history, but I'll just focus on these few. And you could say that this kind of timeline, the apparatus that creates such a timeline, rival forces such as birth and mortality rates in terms of their importance in the composition of a social population. Asian America then is not a stable existing entity, but rather this very timeline or rhythm of appearance, disappearance, reappearance, redisappearance. The Asian American timeline then is a sign of a kind of American sociologic through which Asian Americans have always been governed preemptively. Patricia Clough explains this sociologic in biopolitical governance following Foucault in these terms. I'm going to read a longish quotation here. Biopolitical governance focuses on species life, expressed in terms of the capacity for life across populations, while the sociologic of biopolitics is at first concerned with rates, averages, norms, deviations, where the individual is taken as a member of a group, say the criminal, the insane, the poor. Increasingly, the sociologic comes to function where normal is no longer the opposite and necessary complement to abnormal, deviant, or dysfunctional. This sociologic, rather than place the individual in a group, complicates the individual in terms of his or her own propensities, his or her affective capacities, which are calculated by drawing on digitized databases across institutional settings that carry the trace of the individual's behavior to be read as tendencies. Rather than represent the individual as a member of a group, this sociologic is meant to evaluate the individual in terms of a statistical profile in order to assess his or her risk factors or what his or her future might or might not come to be. That is, the individual increasingly is treated informatically or technically, and as such is governed preemptively, evaluated or assessed in the present in terms of probably future outcomes. So in 1882, when the Chinese Immigration Exclusion Act was first instated, there were still some exceptions, interestingly, students, certain diplomats, and so on. And the Immigration Act of 1924, which listed quotas by national origin, 100 people from Japan, 100 from Korea, and so on, that which also included Middle East and South Asia, that the category of ineligible for citizenship was instated, but at the same time, there were always going to be some Asian Americans, even if only a few hundred. It's a very interesting kind of history. The strangely hauntological or indeterminate space then created within America preemptively primes every new immigrant to enter the space of present absence and to give it form, to materialize it themselves fully only by remaining always impartially materialized. We might think recently, I read an article in the New York Times, the sort of strange situation of Chinese immigrants who came to Queens in their 50s. The woman was recently passed away through violence. And there was a big GoFundMe where Asian Americans donated, strangers around the country, donated money to help cost the covers of the funeral. And the widow was sort of like amazed, like, who are these people who found us and recognize us as part of some community? So this at a time when, as Byung-Chul Han points out, globalization de-sites culture. In other words, takes culture out of its location. The truth of the Asian American timeline is that communication without community has always been at the origin of Asian America. It isn't simply an encroachment from the future by technological development, more like its insidious predecessor planted in the past. This means that community without communication, simple presence, being at home in the world, is impossible without risking the disappearance of Asian America's own historicity. If Asian Americans appear through a one-dimensional assertion of identity, at that moment, the history that supports such a claim itself is at risk of disappearing. For Cha, then, the social logic of immigration management is part of an apparatus too fundamental, too foundational to Asian America for there to be any question of an ideal of presence, community in presence, visibility en masse. But the strange beauty of this apparatus is that it allows every specific individual trajectory to be recognized as Asian American, even though each one is a stranger and comes with an unknown, mysterious story. Even without community then, joined only by the artifices of communication, community effects might still happen. GoFundMe. Han defines ritual as constituted by symbolic perception. Symbolic perception as recognition is a perception of the permanent. The world is shorn of its contingency and acquires durability. We can define rituals as symbolic techniques of making oneself at home in the world, temporal techniques of making oneself at home in the world. Rituals are in life, quoting Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, rituals are in life what things are in space. In ritual, as in performance art, Cha shows us that it isn't you or me. It isn't the non-present. It isn't you or me present here. Rather, it's the non-present yet non-absent ones who are to be invoked. If ritual evokes communal presence outside of the transactions of communication exchange, then Cha's rituals point to the importance of Asian Americans performing ceremonies for indeterminate others, for that is who they have always been to themselves. Cha then assembles fragments for an experience of fragmentation that isn't quite fragmentary. And what makes this a whole then, if it is a whole, is not a larger structure that subsumes the fragment, but a different context composed by the ritual dimension of Cha's work. Ritual stands in for an indeterminate whole. What Cha does then is to take this Asian American timeline and turn it into epic. And if I had a lot more time, I would have loved to introduce James Joyce's Ulysses and contemplate sort of the obscenity trials along with the kind of obscurity and immigration trials. But obviously I will bracket that. And just mention that Cha performs the fragment. The reading of a fragment is an important part of the obscenity trials where Ulysses was banned from publication. When the judges were forced to read it in its entirety, no one was aroused. So this kind of performing of a fragment seems important. And Cha's heightening of the potential danger, the affective volatility of the fragment seems relevant here. We've all participated in that today. So Cha heightens then our perception of what is missing, the affect of missing, of actively missing this kind of absence that can be made present through this pure transitivity of our missing, the affect between absence and presence. And we can then ask, can there be symbolic perception of an absence, of the absence of symbolic perception, to flip Han's diagnosis? Cha's question is more than inquiry. It is perhaps a ceremony for us to ask the same apparatus to confer such a symbolic recognition. If Cha has taken this Asian American timeline and turned it into epic, she has done so perhaps to offer us a way to experience recognition of our homeliness through the strangest of fragments. And it is perhaps in this sense that we can think of Dictee as the text that she herself has received.
So thank you, everybody. I was really focused on the resonances between our presentations. And I thought I'd just, as a kind of light moderating, kick us off with a question, but please do not follow my lead. And I hope that we can discussion and then open up the floor, to any questions from the audience. Particularly thinking about the way that noise, the noise functions as a consistent motive, in all of our presentations. I was particularly curious about listening to Yuna's presentation about this Asian American timeline, and perhaps just introducing a little bit of my own personal history, how I was introduced to Cha, in Korea, at university as very much an American author. So I was introduced to Dictee along with The Bluest Eye, so Toni Morrison. And so on that note, starting off with a more simple question, I'm curious about Cha as an American author, and particularly the kind of physicality, the noise of that physicality that everyone seems to be very heightened to in their presentations. And I was curious, as a simple question, that in your own reading of Dictee, particularly the kind of body that it performs, was there anything in particular, in the reading of Dictee, that that you found especially striking in this question of something that both disrupts our story of America, but is also very much a part of it? So the simple question is, in your reading of Dictee, what about not so much its voice, but its noise that you found especially striking, memorable or inspirational or even threatening? Josh.
Okay. I think, when I think of noise, I tend to think of noise as sort of dismissed as that which is not coherent or not communicative. And I think about the way that all sorts of forms of intellection and speech and communication by folks of color, certainly by immigrants, gets registered as noise. And I would say my experience with Dictee has always been, and with Cha's work, and this is one of the reasons I couldn't actually write about the performances, is that they really do sort of slip away from me. So what I actually have to be present to is my own inability to let go of the need to grasp it and to hold on to it, right? And to actually recognize that in that which is dismissed as noise or dismissed as incommunicable or as nonsensical, that there is actually a whole texture of communication that is sort of moving and working through the self, but it means giving up the scholarly impulse to capture and define and to categorize, and instead turning oneself over to the experience that the text itself invites you into, which is a kind of displacement and disorganization of yourself in relationship to the language of the text. So it revalues noise into something else, into something generative that makes worlds, as you were suggesting.
It's like your introduction of the family photograph, like into this institutional discourse. Like,
Yeah, and like just briefly on that, like family photographs are another kind of noise, right? Like when people die, they're just devalued, they're sort of disappeared, as opposed to like the work hanging on the wall. And so what does it mean for those types of things also to be allowed to speak or sing in their own kind of noisy, raucous, but also beautiful way?
No, I'm like, perhaps on that note, I'm very curious about your manipulations, like your almost like willful destructions, like or improper use, let's say, of microphones, infrared cameras, like using the technology against itself to produce noise as a way of contact, of transmission. And it was very striking, especially just thinking about the last presentation, about this notion of Asian America itself as a question of not so much like the more conventional idea that with media we are having like the loss of a community because of communication. But what does it mean to have communication like that precedes, in a sense, that of community, so that the ideal, like the fantasy, is not that of the presence of the community, of the body? So I was very curious on that level about the noise that you are drawing out, like in your own apparatuses, and perhaps particularly in your reading of Dictee, like what you found especially challenging, inspiring, like as you were manipulating, like and creating your own technologies.
Oh, I just went up. Hi. It says dead battery! Exclamation point. Thank you.
So that was really,
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, it's like, I'm not really doing that much manipulation. It's kind of just, things are happening. And I'm just kind of collaborating with that. It's like a contact with the universe. I spend a lot of time, it's just like me, and a light bulb in a room, like, so you're from around here. And I think if you pay your attention to anything, energy arises. And maybe that's something about Dictee. It's certainly something that's special about Dictee being shared through the body, right? Like how different this text is through every person's body, everybody's voice today than when I'm alone with it, reading it in my mind. And it's just, I don't know, shocking. All of the different resonances that it makes. And yeah, I guess something that's interesting about the sounds that are coming through is there's so much like the way that Cha writes in Dictee, right? So there's so many words that are coming through this microphone that are clipped and repeating and become layered on each other in these contrapuntal rounds. And It's kind of interesting because there's not like that much audio in the Cha presentation upstairs. Though actually yesterday I was spending some time with it and there is a glitch that appears in mouth to mouth. And it's like, it starts like kind of like stopping and starting, but the sound continues. So it's like as she's making the vowels of like, it's like stretched out for a really, really long time, but the sound of rain continues, right? And she's like in the white noise of the screen. And that white noise in Dictee, right? That kind of like fragmentation and bubbling forth is so generous and also shattering, right? Like these just blank pages that suddenly appear in the middle of a text that we're just left to kind of breathe with. So, I mean, yeah, it's something that's interesting about the sound that I'm getting because it's so much in her voice. There's actually a moment where you can hear 아직도, 아직도, and that gets looped in from the microphone, and it's exactly something that is in passages, passage. And it made me think of your piece, your catalog piece, actually, because 아직도, I think, it's kind of translated as still, which is, right, has this kind of double meaning, like still as in not moving, but still as in enduring, continuing. Which is, yeah, how her words, how the work works and keeps moving.
I have a little, maybe just anecdote. I just experienced your work. Wait, upstairs, upstairs. And so it was my first encounter. And I entered the room and it was red. And I didn't know where in the piece I was, beginning, middle, and just it was very trance-like and immersive. And then the image appeared of the mountains, and it was clear. And it was the first moment from where I was standing where I saw the plate of glass. I don't know if everyone's been up there. You should go. The plate of glass. It just came clear, and I saw it rather than through it, around it, everything, all the complexities of layers, all the noise. And I just saw that clear glass. And it's not that the projections weren't happening, it just happened to be a very still and sort of bright image. And that's when I saw, oh, here are the holes, and you could see the holes really clearly. And my first association was, of course, these are bullet holes. Bulletproof glass can be shot. And it was the sign of violence. That was my first association. And then I looked at all the holes, and I have no idea if this is like completely off. Sorry, it's just an anecdote, but I realized, oh, they're in the shape of the Big Dipper. These are the Taoist, the shamanic 7 stars. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, I just felt this, the noise was still noise. It didn't become clarity, but it shifted in the sense of, we aren't gonna wait for noise to go away to find our way, but like signs of violence still have to be the guide, right? We have to find our way through these signs of violence. And then the piece moved on. And so I just had that one experience. So this was my kind of just a little free association, but I thought I'd maybe mention your work in our conversation.
Wait, can I share those? In that the scene you're talking about is at the DMZ, and it shows, it kind of ends on the horizon line of North Korea. 2 freeze frames, actually, as you point out, it is an image that is still, but still repeating. And something happens in the noise there. It's the very first pop song that came through the radio, and it's Faith Evans, her remix of the original song by The Police, I'll Be Watching You, which is like a stalker surveillance anthem. And, you know, she made this remix, I'll Be Missing You, for Biggie. And just, it was so like special when it came on, to think about. I mean, also again, like a different kind of, I don't know, like a noise of loss, right? That like her constant refrain is like, every step I take, I'll be missing you, right? It's this kind of one of eros and still and still. And yeah, I love that you saw the stars. It's, yeah, it's Chilsung. They rule the passage between life and death.
Yeah, I noticed that the racing time stamp on the video stopped at that moment, and it was like, you know, yeah, but terrifying, because is it death? Is it rest? What's the difference? Which side of that glass are you on? Seemed important.
Actually, on that note, I thought one of the things that when I was listening to the presentations, but also through the reading of Dictee, the way that how it compels us, like to, I think, at least in my case, yearn for a richer language, like for talking about death, like, and just in the case, you know, in your presentation, I was thinking about that. The way that you were describing a kind of history of Asian America, like the some Asian Americans that are always a part of this kind of unassimilable remainder that is part and parcel of immigration law. There's always some of us, like whoever that some might be. Like, and the way that you were drawing out this dynamic of appearance, appearance, disappearance, reappearance, like, and what it might be to or the kind of necessity to think beyond terms of life, death, populations, like, and the complexity of what it means to disappear, to always reappear, but never fully. Like, so I wondered if, on that note, perhaps I could ask you to speak a little bit more, like, about. I mean, I was really curious about the obscenity trials, but that may be for a later time. But there is the question of death, like, and presence and absence that like runs throughout this presentation, but also the question of violence, like, which are not necessarily, like, they are intertwined, perhaps necessarily so, like, as part of that Asian American timeline. But perhaps I could ask you to speak a little bit more, like, about this. The complexity or the necessity of the complexity of a language of death that you particularly were drawing out, like, regarding the work of Cha.
I really felt grateful for the context within which I was able to present today, because it isn't so common that we can actually deal with Asian American history without the reference point being a kind of single-minded drive towards voice, visibility, identity, some kind of like assertion and claim. And it isn't that there's any sense of a denial or refusal, but simply that there has to be a recognition of where is the site of emergence for these kind of desires and yearnings, and whose voice is speaking. It's a very American, I suppose, discourse that wants to single-mindedly believe in the value and the power of visibility, identity, voice. And of course, this is not to discount the legacy of the civil rights movement, but I believe even the civil rights movements have been somewhat, it's easy to kind of reductively use them as a certain kind of reference point. Whereas in each moment, I think politically, every articulation has a negative dialectics. It's very strategic within a terrain and context. And to try to remember that today feels unusually hard. And I think it's because violence is, that's why I was really mesmerized by those holes in the pane. Are these stars? Are these bullets? Because violence is, it's too quick to push us into simple oppositions. So
I saw you nodding.
No, I was just
Oh.
nodding because it was really elegant and well thought through. And
I can continue, but I'm also aware of the time. So if there's any questions from the audience. No comment? I've been told as a teacher, I'm never good at that moment of where you're supposed to hold the pause to allow, and I always rush in, with my own, as I'm doing now. But I see a hand. Yes, Francisco.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations and to everybody that read today as well. I work here at the Whitney in accessibility, and I know that we've acknowledged that there's ASL. We did visual descriptions of the different images throughout the book, and I know that also this is a longer question of translation. So I wondered if you all might want to speak to the translation both in accessibility, but also at large within the legacies of Dictee.
So the question was about about the legacies of translation, not only thinking about the condition in which we our reading and our presentation circulated.
just a small comment. I don't know much about its actual publication history in relation to translation, but I did sort of notice that, you know, in one of the essays in Cha's own compilation of apparatus theory, the book Apparatus, there's an essay by Maya Deren I was reading this morning, talking about this sort of reverence for the artist. And sometimes that reverence for the artist translates into hyper articulate performance of what I sometimes wonder, like, you know, what were the voices in Cha's head writing Dictee? Like, we all come up and try to be heard and to kind of honor the artist. But in many ways, I wonder whether there's a kind of translation happening there undercover where we don't hear, I don't know what is the right word, like the grain of the voice maybe as fully as we might. The kind of breaking of voice, of language, the not performed, but a kind of earnest difficulty to read, to be heard. And she shared with Joyce an interest in blindness. And it seems important that she never is privileging nor romanticizing like speech, non-speech, sight, non-sight. And so this is just what your comments made me think of, that sometimes we translate everything into a kind of, don't know what to call it. It's a kind of body, I suppose, a performance body. And not to make this too corny here, but I think there are all kinds of spaces of vulnerability we won't do and where we won't go. And probably, in fact, Dictee actually is more about that.
I might say, I was just thinking about the way that the relationship between translation and relation, and that was making me think about an argument by Summer Kim Lee, who was a performance theorist, an Asian American studies scholar, and she sort of talks about the way that queer folk, Asian American folk are sort of asked to come out into relatability, right? So this has something to do with the kind of visibility, right? Being present and available to be relatable. And she points out that this is often relatability without relation, and is looking for other kinds of ways of maybe staying in, not being relatable in order to find new ways towards relation. And, you know, I think one of the things that translation can do is make something relatable and accessible. And one of the things I experience across reading Dictee are like not having any French, and actually like just not, it is just a kind of wall of non-relation whenever I come upon those moments. And that it actually does kind of open up to other potentialities for being that are not about being accessible or relatable, but about the kind of disjuncture that happens there. And it always strikes me that at the end of the novel, the address to the mother, just kind of, I was thinking when you were talking about the resonances that come out, and I was kind of shocked today listening all the things where something would come out and I'd be like, oh God. And that gesture to the mother, to sort of take it back to the photo of my grandparents and her desire to address her mother, just always reminds me of this story in my family where my mother spoke Japanese for the first 5 years of her life. My grandfather was stationed elsewhere, and my mother and her twin sister got really sick. And my grandmother made a stark decision at 5 when she was trying to interact with American doctors speaking English, and my grandmother didn't speak much English, that she would stop speaking to her daughters in Japanese. And they, because she was like, you won't be able to function in the US when we go to the US. And so she made a decision at that point never to actually really be able to communicate. My grandmother's English was always really beautiful, you know, but not always accessible. And when she was dying, that was something that my mother would talk about, is not being able to really talk to her fully, right? They could talk and they could move, but there were things they couldn't say because there was no way to be accessible across this kind of gulf and bridge of translation, but that was actually the terms of their relationship, right? So it became a form of relation that wasn't necessarily grounded on being accessible, but actually on being not knowable to each other. And that could be really powerful too, even though it was painful to live through for them.
I'm thinking of when I was a young teenager, I kind of saw my mom make a choice that she would no longer speak English to doctors in the US because they sort of refused to understand her. So she just decided that she would refuse to speak to them in English or in any language anymore. And so I kind of became her interpreter and sometimes her performer. And I'm thinking of that kind of like act also as, you know, one of resistance and opacity. And Cha's work functioning right now and the kind of resonance I think that's having among artists and in the art world, and just thinking about the larger biennial and the themes of abstraction that David and Adrian have been talking about. And yeah, just like the kind of, I think like you're saying, maybe that a kind of relation through that refusal feels really up right now, and that she's such an influence, right, in this kind of dialogue and these sort of cycles around identity politics, like particularly as played out in the art world or in the Whitney Biennial, and how she even, you know, that her work, that Dictee, was controversial of whether or not it would be accepted by the Asian American community as being representative enough, right, of what that community might be, right, and how because she works with the fragment, it seemed like maybe that was avant-garde in a way that wasn't a part of, that wouldn't translate into a sort of imagined collective experience. And then there kind of being, a shift in the conversation around her work, and this sense that the way that she works with the fragment is actually such an embodied way to talk about the fragmentation of diaspora, and to kind of resist this relatability or translatability is actually a form of relation.
I think the only thing I'd add to what's already been said is, the sort of distinction between what it means to be translating as opposed to being translated. And I think what's very interesting, I find in Dictee, is that those two positions keep on flipping back and forth. I think one of the things that one could say that has often been said about translation is that translation, like reproduction, like performance, if it is not about reducing the copy as a derivative of the original, but if we can somehow displace the significance of the origin, so that the copy produces copies upon copies, so that the origin itself becomes insignificant. Identity, voice no longer is as important if copies proliferate. Walter Benjamin. But I think one thing I just wanted to add to what's been said is Karl Marx. When in the 18th Brumaire, he has a famous quote about. There's a famous passage where he talks about the difficulty of revolution, and how hard it is to change because the traditions of the past weigh like a nightmare on the present, on the living. And he compares that to being bound by the mother tongue, so that if we are to be fluent, in the next language, we can't constantly translate, we must in a sense forget the mother tongue. And I'm very curious about this question of forgetting, the mother tongue, because forgetting could also be an erasure or negation, but forgetting could also mean a recalibration, or you talked about tendencies, but a different tendency towards the mother tongue or towards mother, where mother isn't mother, but mother could be mother. And on that note, I just wanted to, I was recently reading about how the linguist Roman Jakobson, while he was himself in exile, during the Second World War, was particularly interested in the babble of children. So this is before children acquire any, before they acquire language. And their babble, he notices, he observes that they have a phonetic capacity that far outstrips any polyglot. So it is astounding, the range of sounds, phonetic sounds that a child is able to produce. And the interesting point here is that, but when the child then acquires language or acquires the desire for language, it's not just that they forget sounds that they don't need, but there's a total forgetting. So there's a fundamental break between that wide-ranging phonetic capacity and then a sudden kind of silence, through the desire of language. And the scholar Daniel Heller-Rosen talks about what it might mean to think about that babble, not necessarily as something that we've lost, and seek to regain, but to think always about that silence that undergirds our capacity to communicate, and what it means to think of, constantly evoke that babble, but also the silence, as that which enriches the way we speak and not speak to each other. And I've often thought about this, particularly in relationship to Cha's work, the evocation of that babble, that noise, but also the silence, that could be a loss, but it's also a necessity.
I just want to add just one more reference while you're on this point. Hosu Kim has a really incredible essay called The Parched Tongue. And I think this is really a useful reference in relation to the question of translation, which translation studies is actually quite diverse and complex, but without getting into that, there is generally a sense of bias towards the good translation and the relationship of different languages. So the entire space of in between, which you could say is where migrant lives are lived in some, when you take away the sort of destination of mother, but also second mother, stepmother, what happens, right? So in this essay, Parched Tongue, there's really interesting, Hosu Kim is a sociologist, but really interesting kind of sort of necessity to use formal experimentation and to work with what it means to have untranslated text, and footnotes are a whole nother topic, but in relation to language and to think developmentally, but also, for example, the figure of the international student, who are often exceptional categories in relation to things like migration, as themselves occupying a really important, I feel increasingly more important role in terms of how they live language in translation. And translation is no longer like a means to an end, but maybe joins with disability studies altogether in terms of not a critique of the norm, but really, as I was saying earlier about the social logic, really altering fundamentally, like, what is the social altogether, right, ground up.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful way to not so much end, but pause our discussion for now. I just wanted to thank everybody for, kudos to all of you for being here on this very, very long, but wonderful day. So, and especially thank you to the panelists, and thank you so much, Megan. So, and to the Wendy Subway. So, thank you.